What if I told you that while the world burned in the fires of World War II, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle were obsessing over something far stranger than military conquest, something that sounds like it belongs in a pulp adventure novel rather than the annals of the Third Reich? The Nazis, those masters of brutality and calculated evil, were consumed by another pursuit entirely: the search for Atlantis. Yes, you heard that right. Atlantis, the legendary lost civilization that Plato wrote about over 2,000 years ago. A mythical island of advanced technology and godlike inhabitants that supposedly sank beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day. While most historians dismissed it as allegory, a philosophical thought experiment, Hitler's regime treated it as documented history. They didn't just believe Atlantis was real, they believed it was the birthplace of the Aryan master race, and they were determined to find it. This isn't fiction. This isn't Hollywood embellishment. The Nazi regime actually devoted massive resources, entire departments, and countless expeditions to hunting for traces of this lost world. From the frozen wastes of Antarctica to the soaring peaks of Tibet, from Icelandic caves to Bolivian ruins, SS officers and Nazi scholars scoured the globe in what can only be described as the most elaborate treasure hunt in modern history. They measured skulls in Himalayan monasteries. They dropped swastika flags over polar ice sheets. They dug through ancient ruins in the Andes, convinced they were standing on the remnants of Atlantean colonies. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. This wasn't just academic curiosity or the eccentric hobby of a few fringe believers. This was state-sponsored pseudoscience at the highest levels, funded with millions of Reichsmarks and backed by Hitler himself. The hunt for Atlantis was woven directly into Nazi ideology, used to justify their horrific racial theories and their campaigns of genocide. If they could prove that a superior Aryan civilization once ruled the world from Atlantis, then in their twisted logic, Germany's mission was to restore that ancient supremacy, no matter the cost in human lives. The story I'm about to tell you is a journey into the darkest corners where archaeology meets ideology, where ancient mysteries collide with modern evil. It's a tale that begins with mystical secret societies in Munich beer halls and ends with conspiracy theories that persist to this day about secret Nazi bases under the Antarctic ice. Along the way, we'll encounter anthropologists with calipers measuring Tibetan faces, Arctic expeditions searching for the mythical land of Thule, and SS officers prowling Spanish monasteries in search of the Holy Grail. Some of what you're about to hear has been documented in declassified archives and scholarly histories. Other parts exist in that shadowy realm between fact and legend, where wartime secrecy meets post-war conspiracy. But all of it reveals something profound about how a nation's leadership can become so intoxicated by myth that they literally try to rewrite the map of human history. So the question isn't really whether Hitler found Atlantis. We know he didn't. The real question is why they searched so desperately, what they thought they would find, and what this obsession reveals about the dangerous power of myths in the hands of fanatics. Because once you understand the depths of the Nazi fixation on lost civilizations and occult power, World War II starts to look less like a purely political conflict and more like a cosmic struggle where one side genuinely believed they were fighting to restore an ancient paradise. Let's begin where all Nazi occult obsessions begin, in the murky world of pre-war German mysticism, where the seeds of this madness were first planted. The mythology behind the madness. To understand why the Nazis went chasing ghosts across the globe, we first need to step back and grasp the mythology that infected their ideology from the very beginning. This isn't just about Atlantis as Plato described it. This is about an entire alternate prehistory that Nazi theorists constructed, a fantasy timeline where standard archaeology had it all wrong, and the true story of humanity was something far more dramatic. In the Nazi imagination, human civilization didn't evolve gradually from Africa or the Fertile Crescent. No, that was the lie told by inferior races to mask the truth. The real story, according to them, began in a lost paradise, a prehistoric super-civilization populated by Nordic supermen. These were the Aryans, not as a linguistic group, but as a literal master race of godlike beings who possessed technologies and spiritual powers that modern humanity had forgotten. This is where Atlantis enters the picture. Plato's tale of an advanced island nation that sank beneath the Atlantic in a single day wasn't allegory to these people. It was a historical document, a fragmented memory of the actual Aryan homeland. German mystics in the late 1800s and early 1900s had already begun merging Atlantis with Aryan mythology, creating a potent cocktail of racism and fantasy that would intoxicate the Nazi leadership. One of the key architects of this mythology was a man named Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, a defrocked monk who founded a racist occult movement called Ariosophy. Lanz and his followers imagined Atlantis as the Urheimat, the original home, populated by what he called Nordic godmen. These weren't just tall, blonde warriors. In Lanz's fevered imagination, they were beings with paranormal abilities, masters of the universe who ruled through a combination of advanced science and mystical power. According to this narrative, Atlantis fell not through natural disaster alone, but through racial pollution. The godmen had made the fatal mistake of breeding with lesser races, diluting their divine blood. As punishment or consequence, the gods or nature itself destroyed Atlantis in a cataclysm, scattering the surviving pure Aryans to the four corners of the earth. These survivors then became the founders of every great civilization, from ancient Egypt to the Inca Empire. Any impressive ancient structure, any advanced knowledge from antiquity, was actually the legacy of displaced Atlanteans trying to recreate their lost glory. This meant, crucially, that traces of these original Aryans might still exist in the most remote corners of the world. Perhaps in Tibet, where ancient wisdom traditions persisted in isolated monasteries. Perhaps in the Arctic, where legends spoke of Hyperborea and Thule, polar paradises from before the Ice Age. Perhaps even in South America, where megalithic ruins defied explanation. If you could find these remnants, study them, prove they were Aryan, then you could demonstrate that the master race was real, that their supremacy was not just ideology but historical fact. Now, most of the Nazi leadership weren't true believers in the purest occult sense. Hitler himself had a complicated relationship with mysticism, often dismissive of its more outlandish claims. But one man in the inner circle was absolutely consumed by this mythology. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and architect of the Holocaust. Himmler was, in the words of one historian, infected by a virulent strain of spiritualism. He saw himself as the reincarnation of Heinrich the Fowler, a 10th-century German king. He viewed world history as a cosmic racial struggle between the forces of Aryan light and Semitic darkness, and he was utterly convinced that the SS, his elite order, could become a modern priesthood that would rediscover the ancient Aryan mysteries and use them to reshape the world. For Himmler, finding Atlantis wasn't just about proving a theory. It was about reclaiming a birthright. If the Aryans came from a technologically and spiritually advanced civilization that ruled the world, then Hitler's conquests weren't aggression. They were restoration, a return to the natural order that had been disrupted when Atlantis fell. But Atlantis wasn't the only mythical land that captured Nazi imagination. There was also Thule, sometimes called Hyperborea in the ancient texts. This was supposed to be another Aryan paradise, this one located in the far north, perhaps in the Arctic Circle, or even at the North Pole itself. Greek and Roman writers had mentioned Thule as the northernmost land, a place of mysterious wonders. Occult theorists in Germany transformed it into a lost Arctic continent, a polar Atlantis that had been home to the original Aryans before an ice age forced them south into Europe. The connection between these myths and Nazi politics was direct and literal. The secret society that helped birth the Nazi Party in Munich was called the Thule Society, named explicitly after this mythical northern homeland. Members of the Thule Society believed they were the spiritual descendants of Hyperborean supermen, and that they could tap into ancient Aryan power sources like Vril, a mystical energy described in a popular 19th-century novel. Vril deserves its own explanation because it shows just how blurred the line became between fiction and Nazi ideology. In 1871, British author Edward Bulwer-Lytton published a novel called The Coming Race, about a superior underground civilization that controlled a mysterious force called Vril energy. This force could supposedly do anything: heal, destroy, power machines, even manipulate matter itself. It was fiction, obviously, a Victorian science fantasy. But German occultists took it seriously. Some claimed that Bulwer-Lytton had actually stumbled onto real secret knowledge and disguised it as fiction. Rumors circulated, then and now, about a Vril society in Nazi Germany, a group of psychic women who supposedly channeled information from extraterrestrial or Atlantean sources to help German engineers develop flying saucers and wonder weapons. Most historians dismiss the Vril society as a post-war fabrication or gross exaggeration, but the fact that such stories could gain traction tells you everything about the atmosphere around Nazi occultism. What's documented beyond any doubt is that the Nazi leadership created an entire alternate version of prehistory where Atlantis, Thule, and other lost Aryan realms were real. In this mythology, every impressive ancient accomplishment anywhere in the world was actually the work of displaced Aryans. The pyramids of Egypt, built by Aryan colonists, or at least designed by them. The megalithic temples of Bolivia, obviously constructed by Nordic refugees from Atlantis. Even Buddhism and Hinduism were supposedly corrupted versions of original Aryan spiritual teachings. This wasn't harmless speculation confined to fringe magazines. This became official doctrine, taught in schools, promoted in SS journals, embedded in the justifications for war and genocide. If non-Aryan races were merely corrupted remnants or inferior offshoots, if all true civilization came from this lost Aryan source, then exterminating or enslaving these lesser peoples wasn't murder. It was cosmic housecleaning, restoring the natural hierarchy that had existed before Atlantis fell. And so the Nazi regime, at the very height of its power, devoted enormous resources to proving these fantasies were real. They created entire departments staffed with archaeologists, anthropologists, and occultists. They funded expeditions to the most remote regions on Earth. They measured skulls, excavated ruins, collected artifacts, and twisted every finding to fit their predetermined conclusion. The question we have to ask is, did they actually believe it? Or was it all cynical propaganda? The answer seems to be both. Some, like Himmler, were true believers who saw themselves on a mystical quest. Others were opportunists who recognized that these myths could be weaponized for political purposes. And still others were scientists and scholars who got swept up in the momentum, either through genuine confusion of nationalism with scholarship or through fear of what would happen if they refused to play along. But belief or cynicism doesn't really matter in the end. What matters is what they did. And what they did was mount some of the most bizarre expeditions in the history of archaeology, journeys that blended legitimate science with racial pseudoscience and occult fantasy in ways that still boggle the mind. The machinery they created to pursue these myths was very real. It had a name, a budget, and a body count. It was called the Ahnenerbe, and it was Hitler's archaeological occult bureau, the engine that drove the Nazi hunt for Atlantis. Let's talk about what the Ahnenerbe actually was and what it did. The Ahnenerbe, Hitler's archaeological occult bureau. If the mythology I just described was the fuel, the Ahnenerbe was the engine. Founded in 1935, the Deutsches Ahnenerbe, which translates as German Ancestral Heritage, was ostensibly a scholarly research institute. But this was no ordinary think tank. This was an SS organization devoted to rewriting human history from the ground up, to proving through any means necessary that the Aryan master race had once ruled the world from its Atlantean and Hyperborean homes. On paper, the Ahnenerbe was established as a private institute, initially separate from the formal Nazi government structure. But make no mistake, it was bankrolled by the SS, reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, and by the late 1930s had been fully absorbed into the SS command structure. Himmler was its patron saint and driving visionary, seeing it as the intellectual arm of his elite order, the research division that would uncover the mystical and historical foundations of Aryan supremacy. The budget they received was staggering. Over 1 million Reichsmarks annually, equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today, poured into this organization. This gave them the resources to do something unprecedented: mount large-scale archaeological and anthropological expeditions to every corner of the globe, all in pursuit of traces of the lost Aryan world. To put this in perspective, by 1940 the Ahnenerbe had launched or was planning 18 major expeditions spanning multiple continents. 18. While the world was descending into the bloodiest war in human history, Nazi scholars with SS insignia on their uniforms were wandering through Tibetan monasteries, excavating Bronze Age burial mounds in Sweden, measuring the skulls of Andean peoples, and dropping swastika flags over Antarctic glaciers. The scope was breathtaking. They sent teams across Europe, from Iceland to the Balkans, looking for Germanic and Celtic sites that could be claimed as Aryan. They dug in Poland after the invasion, trying to prove that Germans had settled those lands in antiquity and therefore had a historical right to conquest. They explored the Middle East and North Africa, attempting to link ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia to Aryan origins. One project sent researchers to Iraq and Iran, specifically to study Indo-Iranian peoples, trying to trace the migration routes of the original Aryans from their mythical homeland. But the Ahnenerbe's real fascination was with the extreme edges of the world, the places where legend suggested Atlantis or its survivors might have left traces. These weren't just academic exercises. These were quests, undertaken with the fervor of religious crusaders seeking the Holy Grail. The methods they used were a grotesque parody of legitimate science. Yes, they employed real archaeologists and anthropologists, some of them credentialed scholars from German universities who should have known better. But the research was fundamentally corrupted from the start because the conclusion was predetermined. They weren't investigating to discover truth. They were gathering evidence, or manufacturing it, to support a racist fantasy that had already been declared fact. Skull measurements were a favorite technique. Nazi anthropologists would fan out across a region with calipers and measuring tapes, meticulously recording the dimensions of people's heads, faces, noses, and eye sockets. The underlying assumption was that you could determine racial purity and superiority through physical measurements, that the shape of a skull revealed the quality of the brain and spirit within. This was scientific racism at its most literal, and it was central to Ahnenerbe methodology. They would excavate ancient burial sites, and if the skeletons showed certain features, unusually tall stature, particular skull shapes, they would triumphantly declare them Aryan. They collected folk traditions and myths from conquered territories and reinterpreted them through an Aryan lens, claiming that every story of ancient heroes or gods was really a distorted memory of Nordic colonizers. They studied runestones, megalithic monuments, and ancient inscriptions, finding Aryan symbolism everywhere they looked because they were determined to find it. One of their obsessions was something called the world ice theory, or Welteslehre in German. This was a completely crackpot cosmology proposed by an Austrian engineer named Hans Herbiger. According to this theory, the solar system was shaped by collisions between ice moons and planets, and these cosmic catastrophes had repeatedly reshaped Earth's history, causing flood myths and ice ages. Hitler and Himmler inexplicably gave this pseudoscience serious credence, perhaps because it defied establishment physics and offered a cosmic framework for understanding Atlantis's destruction. The Ahnenerbe incorporated world ice theory into their research, using it to explain how Atlantis could have been destroyed by a falling ice moon, and how survivors might have fled to high altitudes or extreme latitudes to escape the resulting floods and glaciation. It was fantasy built on fantasy, a house of cards made from myths, but it was treated as legitimate enough to guide actual expeditions and excavations. What's particularly chilling is that the Ahnenerbe didn't just engage in pseudoscience. Many of its members were also involved in the darkest aspects of Nazi crimes. After the war, it was discovered that Ahnenerbe researchers had participated in or facilitated medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, particularly in the horrific cold water experiments at Dachau. The same organization hunting for Atlantis was also measuring how long prisoners could survive in ice water, gathering data for the Luftwaffe under conditions of deliberate torture. This reveals the true nature of the Ahnenerbe's mission. It wasn't about scholarship or even occult power for its own sake. It was about providing intellectual cover and mystical justification for genocide. If they could prove the Aryan master race was real, that it had once ruled a paradise called Atlantis, then the extermination of Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others could be framed not as murder, but as cosmic necessity, clearing away the racial pollution that had supposedly caused Atlantis to fall in the first place. The propaganda value of their expeditions was immediate and immense. Every dig, every measurement, every artifact collected became fodder for SS publications and Nazi youth education. They published journals like Germanien that mixed archaeological reports with racist ideology, presenting twisted versions of history where every great human achievement was credited to Aryans. If an excavation turned up tall skeletons or blonde hair preserved in ancient mummies, it was trumpeted as proof. If the evidence didn't cooperate, it was ignored or quietly reinterpreted. One expedition that perfectly illustrates the Ahnenerbe's methods was their 1938 journey to Iceland, a place they believed might be the site of Thule itself. Himmler sent a team of SS archaeologists with explicit instructions. Find a mystical place of worship where ancient Aryans had praised Odin and Thor. The team claimed they had succeeded, announcing the discovery of a Hof, an ancient Germanic temple, inside an Icelandic cave. The problem? When actual Icelandic archaeologists examined the site, they found zero evidence of prehistoric habitation. The cave had never been used before the 18th century. The Nazi researchers had either fabricated the find or grossly misinterpreted natural features as human construction. It was an embarrassment, and the skeptical Icelandic authorities put strict limits on further Nazi poking around. When World War II broke out and the Allies occupied Iceland, the whole farce came to an end. But the Iceland fiasco didn't stop the Ahnenerbe. If anything, it made them double down. By the late 1930s, their expeditions were becoming more ambitious and more distant, reaching into the heart of Asia and to the literal ends of the earth. The most famous of these journeys, and the one that has spawned the most enduring legends, was the SS expedition to Tibet in 1938 and 1939. This is where the Nazi hunt for Atlantis reached its most surreal and disturbing peak, in the shadow of the Himalayas, where Nazi anthropologists measured the skulls of Buddhist monks in a quest to prove they were the descendants of Atlantean refugees. The SS in Shangri-La, hunting Atlantis in Tibet. If you want to understand just how far the Nazi obsession with lost Aryan civilizations went, you need to picture this scene. It's 1939. In the capital city of Tibet, Lhasa, thousands of feet above sea level in the fortress of the Potala Palace, Tibetan New Year celebrations are in full swing. Monks in saffron robes perform sacred dances. Pilgrims prostrate themselves before golden Buddhas. Incense smoke curls into the thin mountain air. And standing among them, taking it all in, are men in European clothing with cameras and scientific instruments. Men who've traveled halfway across the world on orders from Heinrich Himmler. Men who are here because the head of the SS believes this remote Buddhist kingdom might be the hiding place of the last survivors of Atlantis. The German Tibet expedition of 1938 to 1939 is one of the most documented and yet most misunderstood chapters in the Nazi hunt for lost civilizations. Over the decades since, it's been buried under layers of conspiracy theory, occult speculation, and outright fabrication. Some sources claim the Nazis were searching for Shambhala, a mythical underground kingdom. Others insist they were seeking the entrance to Agarthy, a hollow earth realm of supernatural masters. There are stories of psychic Tibetan monks advising Hitler, of annual secret missions to hidden monasteries, of ancient weapons of power hidden in the mountains. Most of that is nonsense, invented after the war by sensationalist writers. But here's what makes the Tibet expedition so fascinating. The truth, what actually happened, is almost as strange as the myths, and it reveals the Nazi racial project at its most systematic and most disturbing. The expedition was led by Ernst Schäfer, a German zoologist who had already made 2 previous trips to Tibet on scientific expeditions in the early 1930s. Schäfer was a real scientist, not an occult crank. He was interested in Himalayan wildlife, in collecting biological specimens, in studying the natural history of this remote region. But by 1938, when he proposed a 3rd expedition, the context had changed completely. Germany was under Nazi rule, Schäfer himself had joined the SS, and now his trip would be under the banner of the Ahnenerbe. Officially, the mission was described as a comprehensive scientific study: geology, meteorology, botany, zoology, and cultural anthropology. And to be fair, Schäfer's team did conduct legitimate research. They collected thousands of plant specimens, trapped exotic animals, filmed Tibetan rituals, and gathered cultural artifacts. They brought back enough material to fill a museum, literally. A Tibetan Mastiff dog was even sent back as a gift for Hitler himself. But that wasn't the real reason Heinrich Himmler had green-lit and funded this expedition. Himmler had become convinced of a theory put forward by Hermann Wirth, one of the Ahnenerbe's early pseudo-scholarly advisors. Wirth had noticed similarities in symbols, decorative motifs, and mythological themes across wildly separated ancient cultures. From this, he'd concocted an elaborate story. When Atlantis sank, the survivors didn't all go to one place. They scattered, fleeing to the highest points on Earth to escape the floods and catastrophes that followed. And where were the highest points on Earth? The Himalayas. According to this theory, Tibet wasn't just a remote Buddhist kingdom. It was a refuge of Atlantean bloodlines, a place where the god-men of the lost civilization had intermarried with local populations and preserved fragments of ancient Aryan wisdom in their monasteries and meditation practices. In Himmler's mind, this meant that Tibetans, or at least their aristocracy, might be literal descendants of Atlantis. The racial purity of these descendants might have been diluted over millennia by mixture with Asian peoples, but perhaps the core genetics, the Aryan essence, was still there, detectable through skull measurements and facial features. If the SS could prove this, it would validate everything: the existence of Atlantis, the global reach of the Aryan race, the racial theories underpinning Nazi ideology. So alongside the zoologists and botanists, Himmler sent an anthropologist. His name was Bruno Beger, and his job was to conduct racial studies of the Tibetan population. It sounds clinical, almost academic, but what it meant in practice was deeply invasive and profoundly racist. Beger spent months moving through Tibetan villages and monasteries with calipers, tape measures, and cameras, measuring and cataloguing the physical features of over 300 people. He measured skull dimensions, nose widths, face shapes, jaw angles, eye openings. He made life casts, pressing plaster against people's faces to create detailed molds. He photographed subjects from multiple angles, building what was essentially a racial database. And the entire time, He was comparing these measurements against Nazi racial typologies, looking for markers that would classify Tibetans as more European or more Mongoloid. Think about what this must have been like for the Tibetan subjects. Foreign men with strange instruments, prodding and measuring them like livestock, all in service of a racial ideology they couldn't possibly understand. The fact that the Tibetan government had invited the Germans and that officials cooperated doesn't change the fundamental violation of what was happening. These people were being used as data points in a pseudo-scientific quest to validate Nazi mythology. And the Tibetans had invited the expedition for their own reasons that had nothing to do with Atlantis. Tibet in the late 1930s was geopolitically vulnerable, caught between British imperialism in India, Chinese territorial ambitions, and Soviet influence from the north. The Tibetan government saw Germany and Japan as potential counterweights, possible allies who might help preserve their independence. So when Schafer's team requested permission to visit Lhasa, the Tibetan authorities agreed, hoping to build diplomatic bridges. They welcomed the Germans with all the hospitality their culture demanded. The SS expedition arrived during the Tibetan New Year of 1939, and they were given extraordinary access. They attended state ceremonies, met with high officials, and were even granted an audience with the regent who ruled in place of the young Dalai Lama. It was a remarkable cultural exchange, one of the first times Western researchers had been given such freedom in Tibet. But underneath the surface courtesy, something darker was happening. Bruno Beger was conducting his racial measurements. Other team members were collecting Tibetan religious texts, not out of respect, but to study them for signs of Aryan influence. They were evaluating strategic and geographic information that could be valuable for future German interests in Asia. The entire expedition had a dual nature, legitimate science as a cover for ideological espionage. So what did Beger conclude from all his measurements? According to his reports, the Tibetan people showed an intermediary position between the Mongol and European races. More importantly, he claimed that the Tibetan aristocracy and upper classes exhibited more pronounced European features than the common people. In Nazi racial logic, this was interpreted as proof that Aryan bloodlines had once ruled in Tibet, that the original Atlantean refugees had established themselves as an elite class, and that over time this Aryan element had been diluted through interbreeding with the Mongoloid majority. It was exactly what Himmler wanted to hear. Back in Berlin, the SS triumphantly announced they had solved the mystery of Atlantis. Tibetans, or at least some Tibetans, were descendants of the lost civilization. Never mind that the entire conclusion rested on subjective judgments about which facial features counted as European. Never mind that the premise was racist pseudoscience. Never mind that actual geneticists would have torn the methodology to shreds. To the Nazi propaganda machine, it was validation. And here's where the evil really manifests. This wasn't just an academic exercise. This discovery, this declaration that Tibet held Atlantean blood, fed directly into Nazi ideology about racial purity and corruption. If the original Aryan settlers of Tibet had declined because they mixed with inferior races, then the lesson for Germany was clear. Racial purity must be preserved at all costs. This was used to justify the Nuremberg laws, to rationalize the Holocaust, to frame genocide as a kind of genetic hygiene necessary to prevent the Aryan race from suffering the same fate as its Atlantean ancestors. There's a moment from the expedition that's both fascinating and chilling in its symbolism. During one of the official ceremonies in Lhasa, the Nechung oracle, a monk who enters a trance state to channel prophecies for the Tibetan government, issued a warning. According to witnesses, the oracle declared that Germany's leader is like a dragon, and advised caution about getting too close to these new friends. The prophecy wasn't wrong. Within months, Hitler would invade Poland and unleash World War II, but the Germans dismissed the warning. They took what they wanted from Tibet and left. The expedition wrapped up in August 1939, just weeks before the war began. Schaefer and his team rushed back to Europe with their collections, their measurements, their films and photographs. They had promised to host Tibetan representatives in Germany, but the outbreak of war made that impossible. The Reich had other priorities now: total war, conquest, extermination, the grand project of remaking Europe through blood and iron. But the Tibet expedition left a lasting mark in two ways. First, in the Nazi propaganda machine, it became proof positive of their racial theories, cited in SS journals and taught to Hitler Youth as evidence that the Aryan race's roots stretched back to Atlantis. And second, in the post-war conspiracy culture, it became the seed of elaborate myths about Nazi occultism. After 1945, sensationalist writers began spinning tales about what the Nazis had really been doing in Tibet. Books like The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft claimed there had been multiple secret missions to find Shambhala, that Tibetan adepts had come to Berlin to help the Nazis with occult rituals, that SS sorcerers had been seeking ancient weapons of power hidden in the mountains. None of this is supported by evidence. The 1938 to 1939 expedition was the only official Nazi visit to Tibet. There were no annual secret missions, no psychic monks in Berlin performing rituals, no discovery of Agati's entrance. But why did these myths take root so easily? Partly because the truth was already so strange. When you know that the SS actually did send anthropologists to measure Tibetan skulls in search of Atlantean bloodlines, it doesn't seem that much more outlandish to imagine they were also hunting for Shambhala. The line between documented Nazi pseudoscience and fictional Nazi occultism is thinner than most people realize. And there's another reason the myths persist. After the war, a small group of Tibetan Buddhist monks were found in Berlin. They had been stranded there by the war and had become minor Axis collaborators or simply displaced refugees trying to survive. Conspiracy theorists seized on their presence, claiming they were occult advisors or members of a secret Society of Green Men helping the Nazis with magic. In reality, they were probably just monks who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but their existence gave conspiracy theories a hook of plausibility. The Tibet expedition reveals something crucial about the Nazi hunt for Atlantis. It was never going to be satisfied by ordinary evidence. No matter what they found or didn't find, the conclusion was predetermined. Himmler believed in Atlantean Aryans in Tibet before the expedition left Germany, and he believed it more fervently afterward, because that's how ideology works. Evidence isn't evaluated objectively. It's filtered through the lens of what you've already decided must be true. And that brings us to another extreme of the Nazi quest, the opposite end of the world from the Himalayas. If Tibet represented the theory that Atlantean survivors fled to the highest points on Earth, the Arctic represented a different myth, that Atlantis wasn't in the Atlantic at all, but was actually Hyperborea, a polar paradise destroyed by an ice age. The Nazis were going to search for Atlantis in the north as well. And their Arctic adventures are where geology, mythology, and Nazi ideology crash together in a frozen wasteland of delusion. Hyperborea, the Nazi quest for the Arctic Atlantis. While Bruno Bega was measuring Tibetan skulls in the shadow of Mount Everest, other Nazi researchers were turning their gaze north to the Arctic Circle and beyond, in search of a different lost world. If Atlantis was the sunken jewel of the Atlantic, Hyperborea was its northern twin, an equally mythical realm that captured the Nazi imagination with almost hypnotic power. The legend of Hyperborea stretches back to ancient Greece. Classical writers described it as a land beyond the north wind, a paradise at the top of the world where the sun never set, and where a blessed race lived in perfect harmony. It was Ultima Thule in Roman legends, a mysterious island at the edge of the known world. Over centuries, the myth evolved, taking on mystical qualities. Occult writers in the 19th and 20th centuries reimagined Hyperborea as a literal Arctic continent that had existed before the Ice Ages, home to the original Aryans, a super-civilization that was destroyed when the climate shifted and the polar ice cap formed. For the Nazis, this myth had special resonance. The secret society that helped birth the Nazi Party in Munich was called the Thule Society, named explicitly after this lost northern homeland. Thule society members believed they were rediscovering ancient Aryan wisdom, that they were the spiritual heirs of Hyperborean masters who had possessed godlike powers. This wasn't just romantic nationalism. This was mystical racism, the belief that their ancestors had been literal supermen dwelling in a paradise at the North Pole. Heinrich Himmler, as always, was at the forefront of pushing these ideas within the Nazi hierarchy. He was convinced that somewhere in the Arctic regions, Scandinavia, Iceland, maybe even the polar ice itself, there must be traces of this original Aryan homeland. If they could find archaeological evidence of Hyperborea, it would complete the puzzle. Atlantis in the Atlantic, Hyperborea in the Arctic, and the Aryan race spreading out from these twin paradises to civilize the world. Iceland became a prime target for Nazi attention. Geographically, it made sense. Iceland sits just below the Arctic Circle. It's geologically active with hot springs and volcanoes, and it's home to the medieval Icelandic sagas, some of the richest sources of Norse mythology. In the Nazi imagination, Iceland might be the remnant of Thule itself, the last visible peak of a sunken Arctic landmass. In 1938, the same year as the Tibet expedition, the Ahnenerbe sent a team to Iceland with a specific mission: find a Hof, an ancient Germanic temple, where their Hyperborean ancestors had supposedly worshipped Odin and Thor. Himmler was convinced these sacred sites must still exist, hidden in caves or remote valleys, waiting to be rediscovered by true believers. The SS team that arrived in Iceland fanned out across the island, interviewing locals about folklore, searching through the sagas for geographical clues, and exploring caves that might have served as ritual spaces. They were looking for any physical structure that could be claimed as a pre-Christian Aryan temple, something that would prove continuous worship of the Norse gods stretching back to Hyperborean times. They thought they found it. The team announced with great fanfare that they had discovered a cave that bore all the signs of ancient religious use. This was it, they declared, a Hof dedicated to Odin, a direct link to the Hyperborean past, a place where Aryan priests had conducted mysteries before Christianity corrupted the north. There was just one problem. When Icelandic archaeologists examined the site, they found absolutely no evidence of prehistoric habitation. None. The cave had never been used by humans before the 18th century at the earliest. Either the Nazi researchers had completely misinterpreted natural features as human construction, or they had simply fabricated the whole thing because they needed to deliver results to Himmler. The Icelandic press had a field day. Here were these pompous SS scholars, so certain of their racial superiority, coming to Iceland and seeing ancient temples where there was nothing but empty caves. The local authorities, already skeptical of Nazi intentions, put strict limits on further German activities. And then World War II broke out, and Allied forces quickly occupied Iceland to prevent it from becoming a Nazi staging ground. The dream of Icelandic Hyperborea died in the lava fields. But Iceland wasn't the only northern target. The Ahnenerbe also sent expeditions into Sweden, Norway, and Finland, searching for traces of ancient Aryan culture. These missions had a dual purpose: archaeological research mixed with political propaganda. By demonstrating that the Nordic countries shared a common racial heritage with Germany, the Nazis hoped to bring Scandinavia more firmly into their political orbit, to create a pan-Nordic bloc under German leadership. SS archaeologists studied Swedish Bronze Age petroglyphs, Norwegian Viking burial mounds, Finnish rune stones, anything that could be interpreted as evidence of early Germanic civilization. They photographed, measured, and catalogued thousands of sites. Some of this was legitimate archaeological work, but it was always filtered through the Nazi racial lens. Every rune was read as Aryan. Every burial was classified by supposed racial type. Every artifact was fit into the narrative of Hyperborean origins. One particularly absurd example of Nazi northern pseudoscience was their embrace of something called world ice theory, or Welteislehre. This was a cosmological hypothesis proposed by an Austrian engineer named Hans Herbiger, and it was as crackpot as they come. Herbiger claimed that the solar system was shaped by collisions between planets and moons made of ice, that these cosmic impacts had repeatedly reshaped Earth's history, causing the rise and fall of civilizations through global floods and ice ages. Most scientists regarded world ice theory as complete nonsense, which it was. But Hitler and Himmler loved it. Why? Because it offered a grand, dramatic explanation for the fall of Atlantis and Hyperborea. In this cosmology, one of Earth's ice moons had fallen and crashed into the planet, causing massive floods that destroyed Atlantis and an ice age that buried Hyperborea. The few Aryan survivors had fled south, carrying their superior genetics and knowledge into the lands that would become Europe and Asia. World ice theory was taught in Nazi schools alongside evolution and standard astronomy, which drove actual scientists mad. But for Nazi ideologues, it served a purpose. It made the story of lost Aryan civilizations feel scientific, gave it the weight of cosmic catastrophe rather than mere myth. If ice moons falling from the sky could destroy continents, then surely the legend of Atlantis wasn't just a fairy tale. The Nazis even incorporated world ice theory into their interpretation of real geological discoveries. When scientists in the 1930s began mapping the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an underwater mountain range running down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, some Nazi theorists seized on it as proof. There, they said, are the mountains of Atlantis, the remnants of the sunken continent, visible even today beneath the waves. Never mind that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is actually a tectonic spreading center where new oceanic crust is formed. This was Atlantis to them, as real as Iceland or Greenland. So what did all these northern expeditions actually find? In terms of validating Atlantis or Hyperborea, nothing. They catalogued Viking sites, Bronze Age tools, Ice Age settlements, all interesting from a genuine archaeological standpoint. But none of it supported the fantasy of a super-advanced Aryan civilization in the Arctic. The evidence showed what mainstream archaeology already knew, that human settlement in the far north was relatively recent, post-Ice Age, and that the cultures there developed gradually like everywhere else. But again, evidence didn't matter. The Nazi propaganda machine took the work of the Ahnenerbe expeditions and spun it into proof of Aryan greatness. SS publications printed articles declaring that the Nordic regions were the Urheimat, the original home, where blonde, sky-worshipping supermen had built the first civilization before migrating south to Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, bringing culture to inferior peoples. It's worth pausing to consider the sheer scale of delusion involved here. The Nazi leadership genuinely believed, or at least acted as if they believed, that every major human accomplishment in history could be traced back to these mythical Arctic and Atlantic paradises. They were so committed to this narrative that they devoted millions of Reichsmarks, countless man-hours, and significant diplomatic capital to expeditions that any rational observer could have told them were doomed from the start. And it didn't stop with Europe and Asia. The Nazi hunt for Atlantis and Hyperborea extended even further, to the most remote and inhospitable place on Earth, a continent of ice at the bottom of the world where temperatures drop to -80 degrees and the sun disappears for months at a time, Antarctica. And here is where the documented history of Nazi expeditions collides most dramatically with post-war conspiracy theory, creating a legend that refuses to die. The legend of a secret Nazi base at the South Pole, a hidden refuge where Hitler's elite preserved Atlantean technology and plotted the rise of the Fourth Reich, Operation Neuschwabenland, Antarctica, and the birth of a conspiracy. On December 17, 1938, a German ship called the MS Schwabenland departed from Hamburg and set course for the most desolate region on Earth. Its destination, a virtually unexplored section of Antarctica between 20 degrees east and 10 degrees west longitude, a frozen wilderness larger than Western Europe. On board were 82 crew members and scientists, led by an experienced polar explorer named Captain Alfred Richer. Their mission, officially, was to survey potential whaling territories for the German Reich. But this wasn't just about whales. This was the third German Antarctic expedition, and it would become the foundation for one of the most enduring conspiracy theories of the 20th century. That the Nazis discovered something in Antarctica, something so significant that they built a secret base there, a hidden fortress that survived the fall of the Third Reich and possibly persists to this very day. Let me start with what we know actually happened, the documented history, before we dive into the murky waters of speculation. The truth itself is remarkable enough. Germany in 1938 was preparing for war, and one of the strategic concerns was access to whale oil. This might sound trivial, but it wasn't. Whale oil was crucial for manufacturing everything from margarine to lubricants to nitroglycerin, a key explosive component. The Southern Ocean's whaling grounds were dominated by Norway and Britain, and Hermann Göring and other Nazi planners feared that war would cut off Germany's supply. The solution was to stake a claim to Antarctic territory, establish the possibility of German whaling stations, and secure access to these resources. So the Schwabenland, a vessel specially modified for polar operations, was outfitted with scientific equipment and 2 Dornier flying boats mounted on catapults. These planes would be used to conduct aerial surveys of the interior, something that had never been done in this region before. By early 1939, the expedition reached the ice and began its work. Over the next several weeks, the German planes flew dozens of reconnaissance missions over what is now called Queen Maud Land. They photographed vast stretches of previously unmapped territory, discovering mountain ranges, ice-free valleys, and even areas of open water and relatively mild microclimate, unusual features in the frozen heart of Antarctica. One pilot, Richard Schirmacher, spotted a particularly striking ice-free region with lakes, now known as the Schirmacher Oasis. Even today, this area is considered unusual because it remains largely snow-free year-round, warmed by local geological activity. And here's where things get interesting from a symbolic standpoint. To mark their claim to this territory, which they named Neuschwabenland, or New Swabia, the Germans dropped hundreds of small metal swastika flags across the landscape. Every few kilometers, as the planes flew their grid pattern, they would release these markers, emblems of the Third Reich planted in the Antarctic snow. In one incident, a plane running low on fuel jettisoned entire boxes of these flags to lighten its load, meaning somewhere under the Antarctic ice there are still Nazi swastikas buried, waiting to be uncovered by future glacial shifts. By the time the expedition wrapped up in February 1939, they had covered an enormous area. By some estimates, they increased the mapped portion of Antarctica by 16%, surveying roughly 150,000 square miles. They conducted oceanographic studies on the return voyage, noting what they believed was a chain of undersea mountains in the South Atlantic, later understood to be part of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The Schwabenland returned to Germany that summer, and the expedition was considered a technical success. But then, in September 1939, World War II began. All plans for follow-up expeditions, for establishing permanent bases or whaling stations, were immediately shelved. Antarctica was forgotten. Nazi Germany had bigger concerns: the invasion of Poland, the conquest of Europe, the war with the Soviet Union, the final solution. The frozen South was the least of Hitler's worries. That's the documented history. A single expedition in 1938 to 1939, motivated by strategic resource concerns, that mapped a chunk of Antarctica, dropped some flags, and then went home. Germany never returned during the war years. They never built a base. They never established a presence. In fact, Germany didn't send another expedition to Antarctica until 1981, 3.5 decades after the Third Reich's collapse. So where does the conspiracy come from? Why do people believe to this day that there's a secret Nazi fortress under the Antarctic ice? The legend began almost immediately after World War II ended. Part of it stemmed from the mysterious fate of certain German U-boats. It's documented that at least 2 German submarines, U-530 and U-977, surrendered in Argentina in July and August of 1945, months after Germany's surrender. When interrogated, the crews gave somewhat evasive answers about where they had been in the intervening weeks. This sparked immediate speculation. Had these U-boats been part of a convoy that smuggled high-ranking Nazis to Argentina? Or had they gone even further south, to Antarctica, dropping off personnel and equipment at a secret base before returning to surrender? The speculation was fueled by the fact that several top Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, did successfully flee to South America after the war. If war criminals could escape to Argentina and live in hiding for years, why couldn't an entire military installation have been hidden in an even more remote location? The absence of evidence wasn't proof of absence, conspiracy theorists argued. It just meant the secret had been kept successfully. Then came Operation High Jump in 1946–47, and this is where the conspiracy theory really took off. Operation High Jump was a massive U.S. Navy expedition to Antarctica, led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a famous polar explorer. Officially, it was described as a training mission and a scientific research expedition, the largest Antarctic operation ever mounted up to that time. It involved 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and 4,700 personnel. But conspiracy theorists looked at those numbers and immediately grew suspicious. Why would you need 4,700 men and a dozen warships for a training exercise? This looked like a military operation, an invasion force. The theory that developed was this: American intelligence had learned about the Nazi base in Neuschwabenland, and High Jump was actually a covert assault to destroy it and capture any Nazi scientists or technology that remained. And then, the theory goes, something incredible happened. The base fought back. According to the wildest versions of this story, the Nazis in Antarctica had developed flying saucers, circular craft powered by some kind of advanced propulsion, possibly based on vril energy or other occult technologies. When Byrd's fleet approached, these Nazi UFOs attacked, inflicting casualties and forcing the Americans to retreat earlier than planned. The evidence for this comes from a few sources. First, Operation High Jump did end several weeks earlier than originally scheduled, and several men were killed during the expedition, though official reports blame accidents and harsh weather. Second, Admiral Byrd gave a press interview upon returning to the United States, where he made some cryptic comments. According to reports, he warned about threats from objects that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. This single quote has been analyzed, dissected, and embellished endlessly in UFO and conspiracy literature. The problem is that the full context of Byrd's comments is unclear. He may have been speaking hypothetically about future aircraft capabilities or warning about Soviet threats in the emerging Cold War, but in conspiracy circles, it's treated as proof that he encountered Nazi flying saucers in Antarctica. From this foundation, the legend has grown to mythical proportions. Some versions claim that Hitler himself escaped to Argentina and then to the Antarctic base via U-boat, living out his years in an underground city heated by geothermal vents. Other versions say the base became a haven for Nazi scientists who continued their work on anti-gravity, time travel, and other exotic technologies, eventually making contact with extraterrestrial beings or discovering entrances to the Hollow Earth. One popular thread of the conspiracy ties Antarctica to the Hollow Earth theory. According to this idea, the Earth is not solid, but has large cavities or an entire inner world accessible through openings at the poles. Some conspiracy theorists claim that the Nazis discovered these entrances during their 1938–1939 expedition, that they found Agharti or Shambhala not in Tibet, but under the ice of Antarctica, and that they established an alliance with the ancient masters dwelling within. It's a compelling narrative, I'll give it that. It has all the elements of great science fiction: secret bases, Nazi flying saucers, hidden realms, the survival of the Third Reich's elite plotting revenge from the bottom of the world. It's been the premise of countless novels, movies like Iron Sky, and entire genres of alternative history. The image of stormtroopers in a vast ice bunker, tending crashed Atlantean technology while planning the Fourth Reich, has become an indelible part of Nazi occult mythology. But here's the reality check. There is zero credible evidence for any of it. No secret base has ever been found, despite decades of international activity in Antarctica. The continent is now covered by research stations from dozens of nations. Satellites map every square meter. Seismic studies probe beneath the ice. If there were massive underground installations, we'd know. The U-boats that surrendered in Argentina have mundane explanations. Their crews were simply trying to avoid capture as long as possible, waiting to see if the war would somehow restart. Operation High Jump's early conclusion was due to unusually harsh weather, mechanical problems, and accidents, not flying saucer attacks. The casualties were tragic but explicable, and Admiral Byrd's comments about flying threats have been so distorted through repeated retellings that they've become unreliable. What's fascinating is why this particular conspiracy has such staying power. Part of it is the sheer remoteness and harshness of Antarctica. It's a place that's still, in many ways, unknown and forbidding. If you wanted to hide something, where better than a continent buried under miles of ice where temperatures can kill you in minutes? The Antarctic landscape itself lends credibility to the idea of hidden things. But there's also something deeper. The Nazi base legend allows for a kind of narrative closure that history itself doesn't provide. World War II ended with Hitler's suicide in a bunker and the complete collapse of the Third Reich. It was a total, unambiguous defeat. For conspiracy theorists, there's something unsatisfying about that. The idea that some remnant survived, that the story isn't quite over, that there's still a hidden chapter to be uncovered, is psychologically compelling. It turns history into an ongoing thriller instead of a closed book. And for some people, there's a darker appeal. Neo-Nazi movements and white supremacist groups have latched onto the Antarctic base legend because it allows them to fantasize that the Reich wasn't truly defeated, that Hitler's vision could still be resurrected from some hidden stronghold. It's a dangerous delusion, but it explains why the myth persists in certain circles. What about the Schermacher Oasis, that ice-free area the Germans discovered? It is real, and it is unusual. Today, both Russian and Indian research stations are located there because it's one of the rare places in interior Antarctica with exposed rock and liquid water. Could it have been used for a base? Theoretically, yes. In practice, there's no evidence anyone tried. The Germans in 1939 simply noted it and moved on. The truth about Nazi Antarctica is actually more interesting than the conspiracy when you think about it. Here was a regime preparing for world domination, and they took the time to sail to the bottom of the earth to plant flags and survey whaling grounds. It shows how seriously they took their resource needs, how global their ambitions were, and how even the most remote corners of the planet weren't outside their sphere of interest. The real story of the Neuschwabenland expedition is a testament to Nazi thorough and their megalomaniacal planning, not to occult secrets under the ice. But Antarctica wasn't the only far-flung corner of the world where the Nazis imagined they might find traces of Atlantis. They also looked westward, to the Americas, to the Andes Mountains of South America, where ancient ruins seemed to whisper of lost civilizations, and where some Nazi theorists believed they could find the answer to where Atlantis's survivors had fled. Atlantis in the Andes, Bolivia, and the mystery of Tiwanaku. If you've ever seen photographs of the ruins at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, you understand why they spark the imagination. Massive stone blocks, weighing tens of tons, fitted together with precision that seems impossible for ancient peoples without metal tools or machinery. Doorways carved from single pieces of stone. Statues that stare out across the high altiplano with enigmatic expressions. And all of it sitting at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Tiwanaku is a genuine archaeological mystery. We know it was the center of a powerful pre-Inca civilization that flourished around 500 to 1000 AD, but much about how it was built and why it was abandoned remains unclear. To mainstream archaeologists, it's a testament to the sophisticated engineering of indigenous Andean peoples. To Nazi theorists in the 1930s, it was something else entirely. Proof that Atlantis had been in South America. The man who brought this idea to Nazi attention was Edmund Kiss, a German archaeologist who also happened to be an SS officer and a true believer in the most outlandish theories of the Third Reich. In the 1920s, Kiss had become obsessed with Tiwanaku. He visited the site, studied its construction, and came to a radical conclusion. This was not the work of native South Americans. This was Atlantean. Kiss's reasoning was rooted in that crackpot cosmology I mentioned earlier, world ice theory. According to Herbiger's framework, when Earth's ice moon collided with the planet, it caused a global catastrophe. Floods, ice ages, electromagnetic storms, the works. Atlantis, located somewhere in the Atlantic or possibly in the Arctic, was destroyed. But a few survivors, the Aryan elite of that civilization, managed to escape in ships or even primitive aircraft. Where would they go? They would flee to high ground, the highest places they could find, to escape the rising waters and the ice. And one of the highest inhabited regions on Earth is the Altiplano of Bolivia and Peru, the plateau around Lake Titicaca. According to Kiss's theory, Atlantean refugees reached this area and established Tiwanaku as a colony, an attempt to rebuild their lost civilization in a new land. This would explain, in Kiss's mind, why Tiwanaku's stonework is so advanced. These weren't primitive indigenous people figuring out masonry through trial and error. These were Atlantean engineers with knowledge handed down from a super-civilization, temporarily displaced to the Andes until they could rebuild their numbers and their power. Kiss published his theories in Germany, including novelized versions that read like alternative history science fiction. And they found an eager audience. Nazi publications began printing articles declaring that Tiwanaku was a Nordic city built by Nordic men, representatives of a special civilization who had arrived in South America in deep antiquity. This was Atlantis, they said, or at least one of its outposts, a place where Aryan blood had once ruled over darker-skinned indigenous peoples. The propaganda value was obvious. If Aryans had civilized South America, if the great monuments of the pre-Columbian world were actually Atlantean, then it fit perfectly into the Nazi narrative of global Aryan supremacy. Every pyramid, every temple, every ancient wonder could be credited to wandering white colonists from Atlantis, denying any accomplishment to non-European peoples. Heinrich Himmler loved it. He was so taken with Kiss's Bolivian Atlantis theory that he authorized a full-scale Ahnenerbe expedition to Tiwanaku. The plan was to send a team of SS archaeologists to Bolivia, probably in 1940, to excavate the site properly and find definitive proof of Atlantean origins. They would dig beneath the temples, analyze the stonework with the latest techniques, and presumably uncover artifacts or inscriptions that would link Tiwanaku to Aryan culture. But the expedition never materialized. World War II broke out in September 1939, and by 1940, Nazi Germany was fully engaged in conquering Europe. Long-distance expeditions to South America became impossible. The Bolivian government, which had been tentatively cooperating with German researchers, backed away as it became clear which way the war was heading. Kiss's grand plan to excavate Atlantis in the Andes died before it began. It's worth noting that the Tiwanaku theory was just one part of a broader Nazi fascination with South America. The continent held several attractions for Ahnenerbe researchers. There were the ancient civilizations of the Andes, not just Tiwanaku, but also Machu Picchu, the Nazca Lines, and other enigmatic sites. There was the Amazon basin, rumored to hide lost cities and tribes of light-skinned people who might be degenerate Aryans. And there was the strategic consideration that South America had large populations of German immigrants who could serve as a political base for Nazi influence. Some Nazi theorists speculated that the Inca nobility had been part European, that their relatively lighter skin and more refined features compared to common Indians indicated mixture with Atlantean settlers. Others claimed that the megalithic walls of Cusco and other Inca sites were actually built by pre-Inca Aryans, with the Incas merely inheriting and occupying these structures. Every legend of white gods in pre-Columbian mythology, every story of bearded strangers teaching agriculture and astronomy, was interpreted as a folk memory of Atlantean colonists. It was all fantasy, of course, projecting European features onto indigenous peoples and stealing their cultural achievements to credit a mythical master race. Modern archaeology and genetics have thoroughly debunked these ideas. The people who built Tiwanaku were indigenous Andeans, genetic descendants of the first peoples who crossed the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years earlier. There's no trace of European DNA in pre-Columbian South American populations, no evidence of transatlantic contact before the Vikings' brief visits to North America, and certainly no Atlantean supercivilization in Bolivia. But facts didn't matter to the Nazi imagination. Just as they had done with Tibet and Antarctica, they looked at an ancient mystery and saw confirmation of their mythology. Tiwanaku became Atlantis because they needed it to be Atlantis. The evidence was irrelevant. The conclusion was predetermined. And here's where post-war history intersects with these pre-war fantasies in an ironic way. After Germany's defeat, thousands of Nazis did flee to South America, including some very high-ranking war criminals. Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie, and many others found refuge in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Paraguay, protected by sympathetic governments or simply lost in the vastness of the continent. This has spawned its own set of conspiracy theories, some with more basis than others. Did Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, escape to South America and live out his life in hiding? Did Nazis establish secret communities in remote Andean valleys or deep in the Paraguayan jungle? And most notoriously, did Adolf Hitler himself fake his death and flee to Argentina, as some fringe historians have claimed? Most of these theories are easily disproved. Hitler's remains were identified multiple times, most definitively by Soviet autopsies and recent DNA analysis. Bormann's body was found in Berlin and confirmed through dental records. But a few mysteries remain. There were certainly Nazi communities in South America, and some war criminals did live free for decades. The fact that real Nazis were in the Andes after the war has blended with the pre-war myths about Atlantis in the Andes, creating a rich stew of speculation. Some conspiracy theorists claim that fleeing Nazis sought out places like Tiwanaku specifically, that they were trying to continue the occult research that the Ahnenerbe had started, looking for Atlantean artifacts or conducting rituals at ancient power sites. There are stories, unsupported but persistent, about Nazi flying saucer prototypes being hidden in underground facilities in the Andes, about secret laboratories where exiled SS scientists continued their work on exotic weapons and propulsion systems. Again, there's no credible evidence for any of this. But the legend persists because it fits the narrative. If the Nazis believed Atlantis was in Bolivia, and if Nazis later hid in Bolivia, doesn't it make sense they would try to finish what they started? It's a logical leap that ignores the reality that fugitive war criminals were mostly concerned with survival and staying hidden, not with resuming archaeological digs. The real legacy of the Nazi interest in South American Atlantis isn't about what they found or didn't find. It's about what they did with the idea. By publishing articles in SS magazines and Hitler Youth literature claiming that Tiwanaku was a Nordic city, they indoctrinated a generation of German young people with the idea that Aryan accomplishments stretched across the globe, that even the most remote ancient civilizations owed their existence to white European ancestors. This was cultural theft on a massive scale, denying entire peoples their own history and crediting it to a race that existed only in Nazi fantasy. And it wasn't limited to South America. The same logic was applied to the pyramids of Egypt, supposedly built by Aryan pharaohs, to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, built by Indo-European settlers, to the Indus Valley Civilization, to the Shang dynasty of China, to Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Every impressive ancient achievement was claimed for the Aryan race, leaving non-white peoples as mere caretakers of monuments their supposed superiors had built. This brings us to the final piece of the Nazi Atlantis puzzle, not the lost continents and ancient ruins, but the magical artifacts and technologies they believed these civilizations had possessed. Because finding Atlantis wasn't just about validation, it was about power. The Nazis believed that if they could recover the lost knowledge of Atlantean science or the mystical relics of ancient Aryan priests, they could gain an advantage that would make them invincible: the hunt for occult artifacts and lost technologies. If the Nazi search for lost continents was about ideology and propaganda, their hunt for ancient artifacts and occult technologies was about power, the kind of power that could allegedly change the course of the war, or even reshape reality itself. And nowhere does the line between documented history and wild speculation become more blurred than in this aspect of Nazi occultism. Let's start with what we know for certain. Heinrich Himmler had a personal obsession with the Holy Grail, not in the Christian sense, the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, but as a pagan Aryan symbol of divine right and cosmic power. In Himmler's twisted spirituality, the Grail was never really Christian at all. It was an ancient Aryan artifact that the medieval church had stolen and Christianized, hiding its true nature as a talisman of racial supremacy. Himmler literally fancied himself and his SS as a modern Knights of the Round Table, a new order of warrior monks who would recover the Grail and restore Aryan mysticism. He transformed his headquarters at Wewelsburg Castle in Germany into a sort of Nazi Camelot, complete with a round table for his top officers, a crypt for meditation on death and rebirth, and a room specifically called the Grail Room, though what he intended to put there we can only speculate. In 1940, at the height of Nazi power in Europe, Himmler personally traveled to Montserrat in Spain, a monastery famous in medieval legend as a possible hiding place of the Grail. According to the stories, the Grail had been hidden somewhere in Catalonia during the Moorish invasions or the Cathar heresies. Himmler met with the monks at Montserrat and apparently asked them directly, "Do you know where the Grail is? Do you have it here?" The monks, understandably confused and alarmed by this armed SS Reichsführer demanding mystical artifacts, told him they had no such thing, that the Grail was a spiritual symbol, not a physical cup. Himmler left empty-handed and frustrated. But the fact that he went at all, that the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany took time during a world war to personally search a Spanish monastery for a legendary chalice, tells you everything about how seriously they took these myths. Himmler's Grail quest had actually begun years earlier through the work of Otto Rahn, one of the strangest and most tragic figures in Nazi occultism. Rahn was a German writer and amateur historian who became obsessed with the Cathars, a heretical Christian sect that had been wiped out by the Catholic Church in 13th century France. Rahn believed that the Cathars had possessed the true Grail and that they had hidden it in the caves around their last stronghold, the fortress of Montségur in the Pyrenees. In the 1930s, Himmler funded Rahn to explore Montségur and the surrounding caves, essentially sponsoring a real-life Indiana Jones adventure. Rahn spent years in the region, interviewing locals, exploring underground chambers, and writing books that mixed genuine research with wild speculation. He claimed that the Grail wasn't a cup, but a stone or crystal, possibly a meteorite, that granted mystical powers. He linked it to Wolfram von Eschenbach's medieval poem Parzival, which Hitler's favorite composer, Richard Wagner, had turned into an opera. Rahn never found the Grail. What he did find was that being in the SS came with expectations and compromises he wasn't comfortable with. Rahn was homosexual, which put him at odds with Nazi ideology, and he apparently grew disillusioned with the regime's brutality. In 1939, he was found dead in the Austrian mountains, officially ruled a suicide by freezing, though some suspect he was murdered by the SS for knowing too much or for trying to leave the organization. But Rahn's theories lived on. His books were edited and republished with more explicit anti-Semitic content, turning his esoteric Grail research into Nazi propaganda. And they inspired Himmler's continued interest in recovering this ultimate symbol of Aryan power. The Grail wasn't the only artifact on the Nazi wish list. There was also the Spear of Destiny, the lance that supposedly pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. According to medieval legend, whoever possessed this spear would be invincible in battle, that it granted its bearer the right to rule the world. When Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, one of his first acts was to seize the Hofburg spear from the imperial treasury in Vienna, a relic that some believed was the genuine Holy Lance. The Nazis brought the spear to Nuremberg and kept it there as a kind of talisman. After the war, conspiracy theorists claimed that Hitler believed his power was tied to the spear, that as long as he possessed it, he couldn't be defeated. They said that when American troops recovered the spear in April 1945, Hitler's fate was sealed, and he committed suicide within hours of losing it. This story was popularized by a 1973 book called The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft, which is full of unverifiable claims and has been largely discredited by historians. But it's become part of Nazi occult lore nonetheless. The Ark of the Covenant is another artifact that supposedly interested the Nazis, though evidence for this is thin. There are unconfirmed reports that German agents in Ethiopia and the Middle East inquired about the Ark's location during the war, possibly because of its legendary powers described in the Old Testament. This is pure Indiana Jones territory, and unlike the Tibet expedition or the Grail hunt, there's no solid documentation that the Nazis seriously pursued the Ark. But the idea that they did has been so thoroughly embedded in popular culture, thanks to Raiders of the Lost Ark, that many people assume it must be true. What about lost technologies? Did the Nazis believe they could recover or recreate Atlantean superscience? Here's where the conspiracy theories really take flight, and I mean that almost literally because much of this revolves around Nazi flying saucers. It's documented that Nazi Germany was working on numerous advanced and unconventional weapon systems. The V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile, the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, various prototypes of ground attack aircraft, guided missiles, and even concepts for orbital bombardment platforms. They were genuinely ahead of the curve in some areas of military technology, which is why Operation Paperclip brought so many German scientists to America after the war. But conspiracy theorists argue there was more secret projects that went beyond conventional science into the realm of the exotic. The most famous of these is the Ahnenerbe, a supposed series of flying saucer prototypes developed by a secret SS research division. According to the legend, these disc-shaped craft used some kind of anti-gravity or electromagnetic propulsion system, possibly derived from ancient Atlantean or extraterrestrial knowledge. The story gets weirder. Some versions claim these designs came from the Vril Society, a group of psychic women in Munich who channeled technical information from beings in the Aldebaran star system. These women supposedly provided blueprints for flying saucers to German engineers in the 1920s, and the Nazi regime continued developing these craft in secret throughout the war. Is any of this true? Almost certainly not. The Vril Society is likely a post-war fabrication or a gross exaggeration of some fringe occult group that had no real influence. The Ahnenerbe sources have never been proven to exist. No physical evidence, no verified photographs, no captured prototypes, nothing. What we do have are some German technical drawings of unconventional aircraft, mostly variations on circular or disc-shaped wings for jet aircraft, which were never built or tested. But the legend persists, and it's been tied directly to Atlantis in the Nazi mythos. The claim is that the Nazis believed Atlantis had possessed advanced aircraft or energy systems, that they were trying to recreate this lost technology, and that they partially succeeded, resulting in functional flying saucers that were either destroyed at the end of the war or spirited away to secret bases in Antarctica or South America. One particularly weird alleged Nazi project was Die Glock, the bell, supposedly a bell-shaped device that was being developed in Lower Silesia near the end of the war. According to claims made decades later by a Polish journalist, this device was some kind of anti-gravity or time manipulation experiment, possibly using mercury plasma spun at high speeds. The SS supposedly conducted tests that killed several researchers from radiation or other exotic effects. When the war ended, the bell was allegedly moved to South America or Antarctica. Again, there's no solid evidence this device existed. No Nazi documents mention it, no witnesses can be definitively verified, and the journalist who publicized the story later admitted he couldn't prove its authenticity. But it's become a staple of alternative history, the Nazi version of the Ark of the Covenant, a superweapon that could have changed everything if only Hitler had had more time. Why do these stories have such power? Part of it is that Nazi Germany really did pursue some weird science. They experimented with Victor Schauberger's implosion vortex engines, with coal liquefaction, with infrared night vision, with nerve gas, with guided missiles, with early computers. They were willing to try unconventional approaches. So the idea that they also dabbled in anti-gravity or occult energy doesn't seem completely outlandish in that context. But the deeper reason is psychological. The Nazi regime represented such absolute evil, and their defeat was so total that there's a kind of narrative satisfaction in imagining they were even worse, even more dangerous than history records. If they really did have flying saucers and death rays, if they really were on the verge of ultimate power through recovering Atlantean technology, then the Allies' victory becomes even more impressive, even more critical. It raises the stakes retroactively. And for neo-Nazis and white supremacists, these stories serve a different purpose. They suggest that the Reich was more advanced, more knowledgeable, more connected to cosmic truths than the rest of humanity. It allows them to maintain a fantasy of superiority even in defeat. If the Nazis had access to Atlantean wisdom, if they were building flying saucers and time machines, then they weren't really defeated, they just ran out of time. Or maybe they weren't defeated at all. Maybe some remnant is still out there, in Antarctica or in the Andes or in some hidden base, waiting for the right moment to return. It's a dangerous fantasy, but it's important to understand it because it's part of why these myths won't die. Every generation seems to rediscover Nazi occultism, repackage it and present it as newly discovered truth. And at the center of it all, tying together the expeditions and the artifacts and the secret technologies, is always Atlantis, the Ur myth, the original lost civilization that supposedly gave the Aryans their power and could give it to them again. So let's bring all these threads together and ask the fundamental questions. What did the Nazis actually find in their hunt for Atlantis? What does their obsession tell us about ideology, mythology, and the dangerous places where they intersect? And what's the legacy of all this pseudoscience and conspiracy 3/4 of a century after the Reich's fall? The verdict: what the Nazis found and what it all means. So here we are at the end of this bizarre journey through Nazi expeditions to the ends of the earth. We've followed SS researchers to Tibetan monasteries, to Icelandic caves, to Antarctic ice fields, to Bolivian ruins. We've examined their skull measurements and their grail quests, their flying saucer rumors, and their base conspiracies. After all of that, we have to ask the obvious question. Did Hitler's hunt for Atlantis succeed? Did the Nazis find their lost Aryan homeland? The answer definitively is no. They found nothing that validated their mythology. Not in Tibet, where the skull measurements proved nothing except that humans share common facial features regardless of race. Not in Iceland, where their ancient temple turned out to be an empty cave. Not in Antarctica, where they mapped new territory but discovered no hidden civilizations. Not in Bolivia, where Tiwanaku remained what it always was, the impressive but entirely earthly creation of indigenous Andean peoples. No Atlantean artifacts were recovered. No Hyperborean relics were authenticated. No mystical power sources were tapped. The Grail was never found, the Ark remained lost, and flying saucers, if they existed at all, never changed the outcome of the war. Every single Nazi expedition in search of lost Aryan civilizations came back empty-handed in terms of their actual goals. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It didn't matter that they failed. The hunt for Atlantis was never really about finding Atlantis. It was about creating and maintaining a mythology that justified the unjustifiable. Think about what these expeditions accomplished for the Nazi regime, even without finding anything real. They provided propaganda material that could be spun into proof of Aryan superiority. They gave Nazi youth exciting stories about their ancestors' ancient glory. They occupied the resources and attention of the SS's most devoted ideologues, keeping them busy with scholarly pursuits instead of questioning the regime's more obviously criminal activities. And they created a mystique around Nazi Germany as a nation that was tapped into hidden knowledge, that was pursuing truths beyond the understanding of ordinary mortals. Every photograph of SS men in Tibet or Antarctica, every article about ancient Aryan migrations, every claim of archaeological discoveries served to reinforce the core Nazi narrative, that the Aryan race was special, divinely ordained, historically supreme. It didn't matter that the science was fraudulent, that the archaeology was distorted, that the conclusions were predetermined. What mattered was the impression it created. And there's a darker layer to all of this that we can't ignore. The Ahnenerbe expeditions and the Atlantis mythology directly enabled genocide. When you believe your race built all ancient civilizations, when you believe you're the descendants of godlike Atlanteans, when you believe racial mixing caused the fall of paradise, then the logical conclusion is that racial purity must be maintained at any cost. The Holocaust didn't happen in spite of Nazi mythology. It happened in part because of it. The pseudo-archaeological work of measuring Tibetan skulls to prove Atlantean ancestry, the racial classification systems that designated some peoples as more Aryan than others, the entire apparatus of Nazi racial science, all of this flowed from and reinforced the Atlantis mythology. It turned mass murder into a cosmic necessity, into the work of restoring an ancient ideal rather than the horror it actually was. One historian who studied this extensively, Erich Kurlander, author of Hitler's Monsters, argues that the Nazi obsession with the occult and with pseudoscience actually undermined their war effort. They devoted resources to dead-end research. They made strategic decisions based on astrological readings and mystical prophecies. They pursued wonder weapons that were impossible to build instead of perfecting conventional arms. In Kurlander's view, Nazi irrationality contributed to their defeat. There's something to that argument. But I think the truth is more complex. Yes, the Atlantis hunts and the occult obsessions were wasteful from a purely military standpoint, but they were central to how Nazism functioned as an ideology, how it motivated its believers and justified its atrocities. You can't separate rational military planning from irrational racial mysticism in the Third Reich, because they were woven together from the start. And the legacy continues, which is the most disturbing part. In the 75-plus years since World War II ended, the myths the Nazis created or amplified have taken on a life of their own. The conspiracy theories about Antarctic bases and flying saucers, about Tibetan wisdom and Andean Atlantis, about secret Nazi survival and hidden technologies, all of these persist in certain corners of the internet and in alternative history communities. Some of this is just entertainment, people who like a good mystery and enjoy speculating about the fringes of history. There's a whole genre of alternate history fiction built around what if the Nazis won? Or what if Nazi superweapons were real? Most people engaging with this material don't take it seriously. It's fun, like ghost stories around a campfire. But some of it is more sinister. Neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups have latched on to these legends because they provide a way to maintain the fantasy of Aryan superiority even after the Reich's total defeat. If the Nazis were building flying saucers and tapping Atlantean energy, if they were on the verge of supernatural victory, then maybe the ideology wasn't wrong. Maybe they just lost a battle in a longer war. Maybe the hidden bases are still out there, waiting. This is why debunking these myths matters. It's not just about correcting historical errors. It's about refusing to let Nazi mythology continue to poison the present. Every time someone presents the Antarctic base story as plausible, every time someone suggests that Atlantis was real and inhabited by a master race, they're giving life to ideas that were specifically crafted to justify genocide. Real archaeology and anthropology have thoroughly demolished every claim the Nazis made about Atlantis and the Aryan race. We know from genetics that all modern humans share common African ancestry, that racial categories are social constructs with no biological validity, that ancient civilizations from Egypt to China to Peru were built by the ancestors of the people still living in those regions, not by hypothetical white colonizers from a sunken continent. We know from geology that there was no Atlantis in the Atlantic, no Hyperborea at the North Pole, no land bridges that would have allowed prehistoric Europeans to reach Tibet or Bolivia. The mid-Atlantic ridge isn't the remnant of a sunken landmass. It's where tectonic plates are slowly spreading apart, creating new ocean floor. Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years, long before humans existed, much less built civilizations. And we know from historical analysis that the texts describing Thule, Hyperborea, and Atlantis were myths and allegories, philosophical thought experiments and travelers' tall tales, never intended as literal geography. Plato invented Atlantis as a cautionary tale about hubris and empire. The Norse sagas described Thule as a strange land beyond the known world, probably referring to Iceland or Norway's Arctic regions. These weren't historical records of lost continents. But facts alone don't kill myths, especially myths that serve emotional or political needs. The Atlantis mythology persists, in part, because people want to believe in lost golden ages and hidden wisdom. There's something appealing about the idea that ancient peoples knew secrets we've forgotten, that there was a time of peace and enlightenment before our messy present. The problem is when that longing gets weaponized, when lost golden ages become racially pure paradises, when hidden wisdom becomes occult power reserved for a master race. That's when Atlantis stops being a harmless myth and becomes a justification for horrors. The Nazi hunt for Atlantis is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangerous power of myths. It shows how mythology can be twisted to serve ideology, how the search for a glorious past can justify a monstrous present, how even educated people can become so invested in a narrative that they ignore or distort every fact that contradicts it. Hitler didn't find Atlantis, but in a sense, he created his own version, a mythical paradise of Aryan supermen that existed only in propaganda and delusion. And millions died because that myth was treated as truth, because racial fantasies were given the weight of historical fact, because the quest for an imaginary past destroyed any possibility of a decent future. The swastika flags that the Nazis dropped over Antarctica are still out there somewhere, buried under layers of ice, slowly migrating with the glaciers. They're physical evidence of how far the Reich's madness reached, literal remnants of a regime that was so desperate to prove its mythology that it touched every corner of the earth. But those flags aren't evidence of Atlantis. They're evidence of what happens when political power meets pseudoscience, when racism cloaks itself in archaeology, when myth becomes more important than truth. They're a warning frozen in ice, telling us that the hunt for lost civilizations can become the loss of our own civilization if we're not careful about who's doing the hunting and why. The Third Reich fell in 1945, crushed between Soviet forces in the east and Allied armies in the west. No Atlantean superweapons saved them, no Hyperborean magic turned the tide, no Tibetan masters intervened. In the end, their mythology was just that: myths, dangerous lies that consumed a nation and nearly consumed the world. The real Atlantis, if it existed at all, sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago, along with whatever civilization might have inspired Plato's story. But the Atlantis of Nazi fantasy, the Aryan paradise that supposedly gave birth to the master race, that was never real. It was always a fiction. A deadly fiction that shows us how powerful stories can be when they're used as weapons. So did Hitler find Atlantis? No. But he showed us why we should be very careful about who goes looking for it, and what they might do with it if they convince themselves they've found it. The hunt for lost worlds continues to this day, in legitimate archaeology and in fringe theories, in history documentaries and in conspiracy forums. But we should never forget what happened the last time a major world power became obsessed with proving that a master race once ruled from a sunken paradise. Because that hunt didn't end in discovery. It ended in ashes, in millions dead, in a civilization nearly destroyed by its own mythology. And somewhere under the Antarctic ice, swastikas still rest in the snow, monuments to the madness of believing your own myths too deeply, of hunting for Atlantis when you should have been building a better world right here on Earth. The story of Hitler's hunt for Atlantis is, in the end, a story about us, about the human capacity for self-delusion, about the terrible things that can happen when we prefer comforting myths to uncomfortable truths. And perhaps that's the real discovery, the one treasure worth finding in all this madness. The understanding that the greatest dangers don't come from lost continents or ancient mysteries, but from the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Atlantis is still lost, and after everything the Nazis did in trying to find it, maybe that's exactly where it should stay.